Hi, everyone. Welcome to Art and Talk. Art and Talk is an online interviewing platform for artists to share their art, creativity, and passion. We embrace all the arts, the traditional arts and the spiritual arts, to bring you diverse and quality interviews to watch and be inspired by. We hope you'll stay connected with us and subscribe on our Art and Talks YouTube channel, and also stay connected with us on our Facebook page as well. We hope you'll have a moment to check out our artist video library and be on the lookout for new artist interviews uploaded weekly. I'm Leslie Sue, the host for Art and Talk, and today we're going to be having an Easter poetry reading, and we're focusing on the theme of the resurrection for Easter and the risen Christ. And to help us with that is our guest poet. And so we'll go ahead and introduce him, Mike Buchanan. Hi, Mike, welcome.
Hi, Leslie. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Thank you for participating in our Easter poetry reading. We're so excited to hear your resurrection poem. Before we do that, Mike, could you just give us a little bit of background on your poetry and give us just a little bit of insight?
Sure. I suppose I started writing poetry about 35 years or so ago, and then it kind of died out. I had a couple of specific situations that occurred, and I wanted to encourage some friends that had gone through a really difficult time. And then that actually died out for honestly about 20 years. I went through some major changes in those 20 years. But 20 years later, I just started picking up a pen and started dabbling in it, as it were, from time to time.
Mm-hmm.
And people seem to be genuinely encouraged by it. So I picked it back up at that point. And by now, I've probably hit close to 200 poems or so.
Mm-hmm. 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 All right, very good. Um, so let's go ahead and get started. We're so excited to hear your poem. So what I'm going to do, Mike, is I'm going to go ahead and pull up an image of a painting of the risen Christ while you're reading your poem. So if you give me just a moment, I'll go ahead and pull that up.
Sure.
Okay. All right. Whenever you're ready, Mike, we'll go ahead and hear your poem.
All right. Sounds good, Leslie. So the title of the poem is He Arose. Adoption became possible when Jesus arose. The far could draw near because Jesus arose. Fear had a source for hope when Christ laid death's power to rest. Satan had been exposed as inferior when Christ passed the test. Reconciliation had a chance when Jesus arose, and forgiveness had a purpose when Jesus arose. You can live with God forever because Jesus came out of the tomb. For your place in a heavenly mansion, Jesus silenced mortality's gloom. Humanity had a way to the Father when Jesus arose. The Father could count the sacrifice when Jesus arose. The ultimate answer of the fact Jesus came to save was given the moment he stepped out of the grave.
I love that. So beautiful. All right, I'm going to go ahead and stop the screen share.
Okay.
All right, so Mike, share with us about this poem on the risen Christ and what it means to you, if you would, please.
Sure. So I do come from a Christian background. I am a Christian. And so for me, Leslie, and for the folks that are listening to this, I know what I was like 35 years ago. And I was pretty messed up. I'd done some really awful things and had actually graduated from a Christian high school even before that. But had seen some stuff and went, you know what? If this is Christianity, I'm not doing it right because they're having more fun, but breaking all the rules they told me not to. So I honestly set it aside for a couple of years. And I was down in San Antonio, Texas, and had a pretty bad experience. And as I was down there, not in an audible voice, not like you and I are talking, Leslie, but I honestly believe that God came to me and said, Mike, let's review your life. And let's talk about what you've accomplished. And so I went through and started listing these things. And every time I would list something, I felt this voice say, is that really you that did it? And I had to say no. And so then the voice essentially said, then who did it? And I said, you did. And I said, and if you will take me back, then I will do whatever I can to serve you. And the only reason any of that's possible, Leslie, is the fact that when man first sinned, shortly after the creation of the world, God had to put a plan in place to bring man back to God. And so for the next 3,000 years or so, he started talking to these people that were called prophets. And they told of a man that would come. He'd be born, he'd live a perfect life, but then he would be crucified. He would die, not crucified, although there is an allusion to the crucifixion even in the Old Testament. But it did speak that the only way that man was ever going to be able to get back to God was through this person's sacrifice. And that person is Jesus Christ. So, you start with his crucifixion, and by then he'd fulfilled somewhere, depending on who you talk to and how you interpret it, it's more than 100 prophecies just to bring that one man. Prophecy is a spiritual word for prediction. But he had fulfilled more than 100 of those, told by various people over the time that it was going to happen. Now, here's the thing, though. Until the third day, until what we know now is Easter Sunday or Resurrection Sunday, until he came out of the grave, those other 100 predictions, those other 100 prophecies that he met, eye for eye, T for T, didn't matter. Imagine it this way. You have somebody that promises you, you're in a debt that you cannot possibly pay. There's no way. You can call all the friends you want, you can get all the loans you want to try and repay this other debt. There's no way you can pay it. And then, Leslie, somebody says to you, I'll pay your debt. I'll meet you on day one. We'll talk about how I'm going to do it. On day two, I'll talk to your creditors. I'll talk to them and I'll tell them what I'm going to do for you. And then on the third day, Leslie, what I'm going to do is I'm going to meet you somewhere at a bank, and I'm going to write a check. And I'm going to write that check to you, no strings attached. All you have to do is accept that check, Leslie, and your debts are done. So you meet with him on day one. It goes exceptionally well. You meet with him on day two. The creditors are happy. They don't have to bother you. They know they're getting their money. Day three shows up, though, and your benefactor doesn't show up. You're still in the same predicament you were. And so when Christ came out of the tomb on that third day, that's what really validated everything else that he had ever done, that anybody had ever said about him. Because even though he himself had raised a couple of people from the dead, no one had ever raised themselves from the dead. So whenever I write a poem like He Arose, I'm reminded I don't have to do it on my own, because quite frankly, I can't. We can as humans. None of us can. But there was somebody that was willing to leave everything they had for a world where most of us would reject him and still say there's going to be people that won't. And for that reason, I will make the sacrifice.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's such a beautiful illustration, Mike, and I'm so grateful that you shared that and the way that you presented it. I'd just like to touch upon two things if we can. There
Sure.
seem to be some parallels in your poetry journey and also in your Christian journey, because you said that you had started right at the onset of the video when you were kind of introducing yourself, that you started poetry a ways back, but then you had several years, I think you said like about 20 years, where
Yes, ma'am.
it was like inactivity, but you were focusing on other things and helping others and things that you had experienced and whatnot. So all these things were going on. And then you came back to poetry. And then you were saying in your Christian walk, that you grew up in a Christian home and then you went to a Christian school. And then there was also some period of time where you kind of got involved into some other things. It's like in both situations, there's some parallels where there was poetry that was prominent, and then some of your Christian walk, and then these things kind of, for whatever reasons, not good or bad, but kind of like, it wasn't prominent then, it wasn't like a focus, and then you came back to it. So I found that very interesting, and it's so beautiful, and I'm so grateful that you shared, Mike, that the moment that you consciously heard God's voice, intimately speaking to you. And I'm wondering, Mike, um, when you heard that voice, what do you attribute it to? Do you think that you were just actually ready, that you had surrendered a certain amount of your life, you had a different focus, that was going to be a walk, not just a talk? But in your words, why do you think that moment, happened?
Thank you for that question. I really appreciate that, Leslie. So I hadn't thought about it the way you had, only because the time frames are different. I only essentially turned my back on the Christian walk for about 3 years, and then 17 years after that was whenever I started writing again. But for that one moment in San Antonio, Texas, I was at probably the lowest moment I had ever been. And they say when you're at the bottom, all you can do is look up. And I'm just fortunate that in the same way that when God himself knew that the time was right, he sent Christ to die for us. And at just the right time that God knew Mike Buchanan needed to hear him again, he allowed things to happen. My choices, to be honest with you, these are all pretty much my choices. He allowed me to make the choices. And it wasn't so much that he turned his back on me, I turned my back on him. But when I realized it, whenever I heard that, the Bible refers to it in places as a still small voice. When I heard that still small voice talking to me, I knew from the time in the Christian school and from some other places, I knew that God was real. I knew what he had done. But up until that moment, up until, as you mentioned, Leslie, I was ready. It was pretty much impossible for me to turn away from what I had been doing to what I knew I should be doing. And in God's love and in his sovereignty, he just coordinated everything so that for the moment he needed me to have, he knew it was going to be there. Does that kind of answer what you're asking there?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's so beautiful. And I appreciate you sharing that. And I just kind of wanted to, get your view and your take on that, because that's a pivotal moment. That's a real hallmark moment, something that, you're really going to remember. And I think that also, all of us can relate to, I know that I certainly can, that, there's times where we have a concentration of something, positive, of that's godly. And then, there's times where, as you said, like, we turn our back, we're not engaging in those activities, and a lot of times we reach rock bottom, as you said. I think so many of us can relate to that. So and then if we open and surrender, and as you said, it amidst in the presence of God's love and God's light, as you beautifully said, we can rekindle and we can, reconvene and kind of, start off, on a new foot and, kind of open ourselves up to, to a new walk, so to speak, and become the risen Christ, just as, Christ is, the example for that. So I just wanted to, point that out because I think a lot of people can probably relate to it. And I love all that you're sharing. And yeah, absolutely. You definitely answered that. Yeah, absolutely.
All right.
Tell us, what does the risen Christ mean to you personally, Mike?
Sure. So when you and I were emailing, Leslie, I mentioned that it's hard for me to separate the suffering that he went through from his resurrection. So then whenever I look at Christ, I have a tendency to see his whole spectrum, which started before time, which will continue throughout eternity. So part of what makes him, the risen Savior, Jesus led a perfect life. So he was willing to make that sacrifice. He did it as a human. He's God in human form, and he did it in the form of a human. He could have called down angels from heaven at any point and said, you know what, we're going to change the plan, but that would have changed the plan in a horrible way. The Bible uses the word in at least one translation, he endured the pain of the cross for the glory that was set before him. And what it means to me, Leslie, is that when I started my Christian walk, I was in a church that was very much a do and don't church. You needed to accept Jesus to be saved, but after that, it was a lot of do's and don'ts. And if you don't do the do's and you do the don'ts, then you might not go to heaven type of situation. But as I come to know him more, and we're talking about now going on just about 34 years, I've come to realize that what his resurrection means to me is that in the same way when he told, when all those prophecies or those predictions were fulfilled, his word can be taken. So later on, whenever he inspires a Paul or a Peter or a John to say, all you have to do is accept him and what he did. You don't have to do it on your own. There's a lot of freedom in that.
Yeah.
I don't have to try and carry the weight of the world on my shoulders. And so, that's part of what it is. But also, and he said this shortly before his crucifixion, Leslie. He said, greater love has no man than this, than a man lay down his life for his friends. And so he gives us not only an example of consistency and being true to his word, but he also gives us the greatest example of love. Mm-hmm. And that's to lay down our life for those around us, mm-hmm. because he did it for us. And he didn't just do it for friends. He did it for essentially enemies. And so when you think about a love that will lay down some people might lay down their lives for their friends, right? Some people might lay down their lives as part of a job. Our military men, our law enforcers, sometimes they have to lay down their lives as part of a job. But in essence, they're doing it for people that they care about. But Christ did it for people who would look at him, hear everything that he did for him, and still say, no, thank you. And to be honest with you, Leslie, my brain most of the time can't understand that kind of love.
Yeah, it's such a beautiful unconditional love. Yeah, that is something that is just so huge just to contemplate and reflect on it. Yes. And I love, Mike, that how you reiterated that you don't have to do it alone, that we don't have to do it alone. So I really appreciate you, kind of highlighting that point again. Before we wrap up our Easter poetry reading, are there any Easter rituals that yearly you engage in, you and your family, that you'd like to share with us before we close out?
Well, we do like to try and attend the service. The last year it's been a little bit difficult with COVID-19. Because COVID-19 hit right before Easter did last year, and so we do like to try and attend the service in person at one of the local churches. And then last year, and I may do it again this year. When I was younger, they had this tradition of what they would call a sunrise service. So I did it last year, and I'll probably do it this year, Leslie, over on my Facebook page. Is I'll just go on and do a live video, sunrise Eastern time. Usually I just grab Washington, D.C. because it's something easy for me to look up on the internet. And I just use sunrise time for DC, and I'll go on and do a maybe 5-10 minute devotion, kind of like what the poem is, or whatever happens to be prudent for that day. But those are the traditions that we have. What about you?
Yeah, well, definitely, attending a service, if possible, or if not in person, then somehow online. Easter egg hunts are, and kind of, even if I'm, not a kid participating in that, I just love to see the children. It's just so exhilarating, the little girls in their dresses and hats, and the little boys dressed up. That's just such a joy. And watching the Easter egg hunts, that's always a thrill. And just, continuing, my walk, with God, and strengthening that relationship, and becoming more Christ-like, is a central focus as well. Easter, or not Easter, but Easter is just such an amazing, amazing time. And, I think also particularly to focus on the resurrection, and on the risen Christ, and the power of that, and just, to be in awe of that is just, is huge.
I think that you used the keyword, the power.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we use power, we use the word power, but sometimes we don't comprehend it. And even when we do, to be dead and raise your, that's a different kind of power.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Mike, we're gonna go ahead and we're gonna wrap up our part one of our Easter poetry reading. And are there any closing comments that you would like to share? And let us know how we can stay in touch with you social media wise, if you would, please.
Sure. As far as social media, I'm at Mike Buchanan on Facebook. I don't really have another. I do write for a couple of online Christian magazines. One is at Faith Filled Family Magazine. One is Faith on Every Corner. So I do write almost on a monthly basis for either one or both of those. If you're looking to stay in touch with me, not just poetry, but also some prose. And then as far as wrapping this part up, Leslie, when Jesus, right before he went back up, so he rose from the dead, and then 50 days later, he rose back to heaven one final time before he comes back. And after he went back up, Leslie, the angels told the disciples that were kind of standing there, probably like we would have been with our mouths open, going, wait, what just happened? They told the disciples in the same way he went back, that he went to heaven, he's going to come back. And so my closing thoughts, I suppose, would be, if you're listening to this and you don't know who Jesus is and what he did for you. It doesn't matter who you are. I don't put into details of those bad years of my life because it doesn't benefit the right people. But I will tell you that I know from experience, it does not matter how bad you are, were, could be. Christ's love, the same love that compelled God to put Christ on the cross, wants to draw you. And he wants to draw you before he does come back. When that would be my closing thought, is he's calling you. Will you answer that call?
Yeah, yeah, that's beautiful. Thank you for those closing comments, Mike. And thank you for being our guest poet on our Easter poetry reading. Thank you so much, Mike.
Thank you for the opportunity, Leslie, to share with you and your listeners.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. Thank you, everybody, for watching our part 1 of our Easter poetry reading. Please be on the lookout for part 2. Thank you again, Mike, for being our guest poet. Thanks for watching, everyone, and we'll talk soon on the next Art and Talk. Until then, be well and be blessed.